My name is Dana Whitmore. I'm 34 years old. I guess 6 flight licenses still don't get you a husband. My Aunt Lenora says it loud in front of the whole family with that syrupy smile she saves for church and public cruelty. Laughter pops like corks around the long table. Cousins chuckle into their wine. My mother lowers her glass, doesn't say a word. I don't either. I don't even blink. We're in the rented garden hall behind my cousin Caroline's engagement party, rows of white lights strung through oak trees, jazz quartet in the far corner, and 52 people who all somehow think I'm less than. Lenora is my mother's sister. She's always found ways to cut me while calling it kindness. Today, it's the same, just sharper dressed in lilac chiffon. I look at her. Her hand rests on her hip champagne flute, glinting like it's ready to toast another insult. Then, across the lawn, a black SUV slows to a stop by the caterer's van, quiet, nondescript, except for the small diplomatic plate and the driver in mirrored sunglasses. He steps out, opens the rear door. A man in a dark suit leans in toward my mother. "The minister awaits you." She goes pale, and I excuse myself. The silence that follows is thick and strange. Lenora clears her throat, suddenly unsure if she's still the clever one. The music has stopped. Somewhere behind me, a waiter drops a tray. I walk, straight-backed, controlled, like I've done 100 times before, though no one here knows it, except one. Caroline's fiancé, Chad, stands just off to the side near the fountain. I catch the faintest nod from him, almost involuntary. Recognition, maybe regret. He knows. Not all of it, but enough. I pass him without stopping. The stones under my heels feel soft from the summer heat, but my spine's ice. I cross the courtyard and head for the SUV. The driver opens the back door with precision. I nod, thank him quietly, and slide in. My mother's still standing, motionless. The engine starts. We pull away, and I don't look back. Inside the car, it's quiet. The man beside me doesn't speak right away. He's dressed formally, but plainly no lapel pin, no overcoat. Just crisp lines and calm power. I glance down at the folder resting on the leather seat between us. It has my call sign. Nothing else, just that. He finally says, "Your presence is requested. Sensitive briefing. High clearance. You're the only one with the certification." My voice is calm. "Where are we going?" He names a base I haven't been cleared for in 2 years. I nod once. He doesn't ask about the party, about the woman in lilac, or the rustle of judgment behind me. He doesn't need to. People like him never have to ask if you've been underestimated. They already know. Outside, the lights of the city blur past. Fireflies flicker in the dark fields off the freeway. Somewhere in that garden, they've probably moved on to cake, to speeches, to pretending none of it happened. But someone saw. That's enough. I remember the last thing Lenora said before I left Michigan 5 years ago. "You think flying planes makes you special, sweetheart? No one wants a woman who lives in the sky?" I said nothing then, too. Because I don't live in the sky. I own it. But that's not something you say. That's something you show when the timing's right. And the minister never calls unless it is. Inside the SUV, my hands are folded in my lap. I think about my mother's face, how it drained when she heard the word minister, how she tried to cover it with her napkin. She spent years telling me I was wasting my time with those military people instead of focusing on something real. She means marriage, status, something she can explain to the garden club. I offered her something bigger. She just didn't understand it. Or maybe she did, and that's why it frightened her. 15 minutes in the car slows. We pull through a security gate lit with red arcs. Not a base, a compound. Heavily surveilled, unmarked. I recognize the shape of it instantly. "You're not just transporting me," I murmur. "No, ma'am," the man replies. "They've been briefed. You'll lead." And just like that, the mask slips. The nerves, the tension, the tiny weight of old bruises from relatives who never looked further than their own limitations, they fall away. Because I remember who I am, who I've always been. They only saw a single woman at a party. But 6 flight licenses don't come from being single. They come from being precise, relentless, unbreakable. They've always said I take after my father, except when they say it, it's not a compliment. He never settled, Aunt Lenora used to say, pouring herself peach tea like it was sermon wine. Always chasing something high and far. Not much good when things got real. What she meant was my father flew. And in this family, that wasn't something to be proud of. He was a crop duster pilot in the 80s, turned medevac in the Gulf, then disappeared into government contracts and shadowy airfields. By the time I was 10, he was just a silhouette in photographs, calloused hands, wind-cut face, smiling next to helicopters no one could name. When I got my first license at 19, my mother said nothing, just folded laundry and reminded me that Caroline had made it onto the dental hygiene program. By the third license rotary, she started sighing whenever I walked into a room. But I didn't care. Flying was the one thing that made sense. Wind altitude control. It was all exact responsive. Unlike the people I grew up around, the aircraft didn't care if I smiled enough at dinner or wore mascara to church. In the air, everything obeyed precision and preparation. On the ground, it was just judgment and choreography. I grew up in a small town in southern Michigan. Cambria, flat corn country, 4,000 people, 3 family names. Everyone knows everyone, and no one ever forgets who your mother is. Mine, Marianne Whitmore, is the kind of woman who carries herself like a legacy. She wasn't prom queen, but she married the prom king. She chaired the hospital gala. She hosted bridal showers like battalion briefings and expected you to memorize seating charts like scripture. And me, I ruined her symmetry. I wasn't rebellious. I was quiet. I got straight A's. But I didn't care about dresses debuts or boys in polos. I loved maps, wind speed calculations, the geometry of ascent, and that made me different. And different in our town always meant wrong. By the time I was 24, I had 4 licenses, fixed-wing private commercial rotary, and multi-engine. I was already on reserve deployment rotation flying intel runs. Quiet work, sometimes humanitarian, sometimes not. No one in town knew. I was gone more than home, which suited everyone fine. Caroline got engaged twice in that window. Aunt Lenora opened a little boutique with floral wreaths and monogrammed towels. My mother started telling people I was doing something with aviation logistics. Even when I saved that missionary team in Honduras, evac'd them out under cloud cover after a mudslide, my family's group chat said nothing. Not even a thumbs up. They didn't mock me outright. It was worse. They erased me in small ways. At every birthday dinner, I got seated between the cousins with braces. Caroline got the toast. I got questions like, "So when are you going to stop flying around and come home? Don't you miss a normal life? Ever think of doing something useful with your skills, like air ambulance?" I learned to answer with a smile. Nod, sip, let the silence do the heavy lifting, because I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. By then, I'd learned the trick. You don't win by getting louder. You win by getting further. Still, it wore on me. Especially the way my mother always looked away when I spoke, like if she didn't acknowledge it, it couldn't hurt her social credit, like it was something to be endured, not honored. Even at funerals when old pilots came up to shake my hand and whisper, "Thank you for what you do," she'd smile politely and pivot to dessert trays. She hated not understanding the world I walked in. She hated even more that it outranked hers. You might ask why I kept showing up. To the engagement parties, the Christmas dinners, the 4th of July cookouts where I stood alone while everyone praised Chad for getting promoted to bank manager. The truth, I kept coming because somewhere deep down I thought maybe they'd change. Maybe one day they'd ask me what I actually do, not to judge, not to compare, just to know me. They never did, but one person almost did. My father. He came back once, quietly. No announcement. Just appeared on the edge of a graduation ceremony when I received my 5th license. I remember locking eyes with him across the tarmac. His beard was grayer, his eyes tired, but they lit up when he saw my call sign stitched onto my jacket. "Never thought you'd come back," I said. "I didn't," he replied with a faint smile. "I came to see if you'd gone further than I ever did." He didn't stay long, said he had to return to a contract. Didn't say what, but that one sentence, it carried me through a lot of empty rooms. When I passed my 6th license exam instrument rating for military-grade avionics, I didn't tell my mother. She found out through someone at the Rotary Club who saw a post, said nothing for 2 months. Then one day in front of Caroline and Lenora, she looked at me and said, "I suppose you'll never be satisfied with an ordinary life." And Caroline, bless her heart, giggled and said, "She just likes being mysterious." That was 2 weeks before the party, before the SUV, before the word minister sucked the air out of their perfect little evening. I'm not bitter, truly. I don't need them to clap for me. But there's a certain silence, the kind that falls after an insult when someone more powerful than all of them appears, and it's louder than applause. They'll remember that silence forever. And for once, I don't have to say a word. The worst part wasn't what they said. It was what they never did. When I lost my first contract flight after a freak storm rerouted me into restricted airspace classified Zone 0 visibility, no one in my family asked if I was okay. Not even when the investigation cleared me. Not even when the report proved my decision saved a medical team's lives. Caroline texted me a meme that week about women drivers. Lenora sent a church devotional about humility, and my mother. She forwarded an article about women in dangerous jobs having lower marriage rates. That's how they punish you in families like mine. Not with fists, with silence, with smirks, with absence. A year later, I came home for Christmas. I'd just wrapped a multi-country transport op across Southeast Asia. 2 governments, 6 airstrips, 0 room for error. It was the kind of assignment that made your blood sharper. But at my mother's house, no one asked. The living room was filled with pine garlands and small talk. Caroline showed off her new ring. Lenora talked about her boutique's Instagram strategy. And I stood there trying not to breathe too deeply because the air was thick with judgment disguised as hospitality. Dinner started with grace. My mother looked down the table at me and said, "Dana's still flying, I think. Isn't that right?" Then she added, "Still single, too." Someone laughed, someone else coughed, and I just nodded, cutting my turkey with surgical care. Because what was I supposed to say? That last week an airfield commander in Jakarta had called me a miracle under pressure, that I'd slept with my boots still on in the cockpit just in case, that I'd rerouted a load of typhoon supplies without losing a single crate. No. That kind of strength means nothing in a house like hers. In that house, your worth is measured in wedding invitations and grandbabies, not medals, not certifications, not calm in chaos. But the deepest cut came in March. I had just returned from a 6-month classified rotation overseas. Can't name the country, can't name the mission, but I was commended, quietly, internally, the kind of recognition that doesn't come with a trophy, just a knowing nod from someone whose name doesn't appear on rosters. I was exhausted, burned out, emotionally hollowed, and I came home for once, just wanting to rest. I stayed with my mother for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, I came down to the kitchen and saw her sitting with 2 women from her church committee. They didn't hear me walk in. One said, "Dana's back, I thought she was. What does she do again?" And my mother, without missing a beat, replied, "She flies cargo, just boxes and supplies. Nothing exciting." She didn't say it with malice. She said it like she was explaining an embarrassing hobby. I stood there just inside the hallway, breath caught in my chest like static. And I realized she didn't lie. She reduced. That night, I packed and left. No fight, no drama. Just vanished into the quiet the way I always do. I slept in my car on the edge of a regional airfield, wrapped in my jacket heart, cracking under the weight of every moment I'd swallowed just to keep the peace. I could have disappeared for good that week. I thought about it. And it wasn't just the family. Word spreads in small towns. The weird Whitmore girl who's never home, who never settled down, who didn't make it work with Chad after high school. They don't know he cheated twice. Even old friends started looking at me sideways like my accomplishments had made me suspicious. Like I thought I was better than them. I never said that. But they heard it anyway. Once I ran into Mrs. Caldwell, my old civics teacher, at the grocery store. She squinted at me over her cart and said, "Still chasing the sky, huh?" I smiled politely. Still building from it. She made a face like she didn't understand. And she didn't. Because how could she, none of them, could imagine a life built on risk precision command, on keeping lives safe at 10,000 feet. They only knew front lawns and Sunday schedules. And when you step too far outside that template, they don't question the map, they question you. But the hardest blow came from someone I never expected. Chad, Caroline's fiancé. We hadn't spoken in over a decade. Ancient history. But one day he messaged me out of nowhere. Said he admired what I did. That he'd always known I'd do something big. That Caroline sometimes still compared herself to me. I didn't respond, because I knew what he was doing. I wasn't his consolation prize. And I wasn't about to be used as a pawn in someone else's war. But his last line stuck with me. You were always the one who flew higher. I guess some people just resented that. That was the moment I understood it wasn't just that they dismissed me. It's that they couldn't contain me. And people like that, they'll do anything to bring you down where they feel safe, even if it means pretending you don't exist. So I let them. Let them call it cargo. Let them say boxes and supplies. Let them tell each other stories they can live with. Because the truth. They took everything I could have shared with them, every memory, every moment, every story that could have connected us. They chose to bury it under their own comfort. And now they don't get to know who I am. But soon they will see. Not because I'll show off, but because someone else will see it for them. And when that moment comes, when the engine hums low and the tires roll across the pavement, it won't be me they fear. It'll be the truth. The quiet truth they never wanted to believe. And I'll just keep walking, because that's what pilots do. We don't look down. We move forward, always forward. I stayed in a motel off Highway 131 for 3 nights. One of those places with buzzing lights, damp carpets, and a tiny breakfast room no one ever eats in. I didn't check in with my name. Just initials. Left the TV off. Kept my bag zipped. I told myself it was temporary. Just a reset. But by the second night, I wasn't sure. I lay on the hard mattress staring at the textured ceiling, wondering how someone with 6 licenses and over 2,000 logged hours could feel so weightless. Not light, not free, just untethered, like I could vanish tomorrow and no one back home would notice. Or worse, they'd notice and feel relief. I replayed the words my mother had used. Just boxes and supplies. That's what I'd become in her eyes. A mover of things, nothing more. She didn't mean to hurt me, I told myself. She just didn't know better. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. She chose not to know. There's a peculiar kind of pain that comes from being invisible in the place you came from. I could be strong elsewhere, confident in hangars commanding on tarmacs, trusted in control towers, but the moment I stepped into my mother's kitchen, all of that vanished. I was 10 years old again, being scolded for asking too many questions. I was 17, told not to wear boots to church because men don't like girls who look like they're running away. I was 22, back from my first solo mission, only to be handed a pie crust and asked if I'd consider culinary school. She never hated me. She just never believed in the version of me that wasn't hers. The motel room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and regret. On the 3rd morning, I opened my bag and pulled out my most worn logbook, the one with sweat stains, torn corners, notes written in turbulence. I flipped through it slowly like a photo album. Each page told a story I'd never shared. A storm over Manila that grounded 5 commercial flights, but not me. A night op in northern Afghanistan blacked out no lights, only coordinates and gut. A private escort across disputed airspace guiding a medical chopper out of a war zone. All done in silence. No medals. No stories told at family gatherings. Just signatures, coordinates, airspeed. Proof of a life they never cared to understand. That night, I sat on the edge of the motel bed with my boots on. Still dressed from the day. No plans to go anywhere. I looked in the mirror above the dresser and didn't recognize myself. Not because I looked different, but because I looked erased. The version of me that used to fight the one that earned every stripe, every patch, every certification, she was somewhere behind my eyes waiting. And for the first time in years, I thought, maybe they're right. Maybe all this flying, all this moving, all this trying to be something more, it was just me running away from being nothing. Maybe if I had just picked the safe life, the clean version, I'd have someone beside me now. A house, a photo on the fridge, a mother who introduced me with pride instead of caveats. Maybe I'd be loved, really loved. And then I felt it, that dangerous tug inside the one that says, "Give up, quietly. No one will notice." I sat with that voice for hours, didn't cry, didn't move, just sat there in that limbo between exhaustion and surrender. At 2:17 a.m., my phone buzzed. Just once. A single message from a name that made my stomach tighten. Major L. We hadn't spoken in months. Our last mission together ended in silence like most things in our line of work. But there it was. You grounded or just ghosting us birds asking. No emojis, no sentiment, just a pulse. Birds asking. That was his nickname for the tactical operations lead who used to call me Eagle Eyes. He never used that phrase unless something real was happening. They were checking on me, and not just for a mission, for me. I didn't reply, but I put the phone face down and stood up, walked to the window, pulled back the curtain. The highway outside was empty, lit only by flickering sodium lights. A gas station 2 blocks down buzzed in the dark. A truck passed headlights sweeping across the cracked parking lot. Somewhere out there, the world was still turning, and somewhere above it, my sky waited. I showered, packed, left the room key on the desk, didn't leave a note, didn't check out, just walked out into the pre-dawn fog duffel over my shoulder boots, tight shoulders square. I wasn't back yet, not fully, but I was moving again, and that was something. I drove toward the edge of town. The regional airfield still had the same old security gate and rusting fence, but the woman at the desk, a new hire, maybe 20, looked up and asked for ID. When I handed her my clearance, she blinked, then sat up straighter. A pause. Then, "Thank you for your service, ma'am." She didn't know my story, didn't know what I carried, but she saw something, and in that moment, I felt it flicker. The pilot in me. Still there. Still alive. Sometimes it's not about pushing forward. Sometimes it's about not letting yourself fall completely. That week I almost did. I almost believed their story about me that I was too much, too strange, too distant, too high above them to belong. But the sky doesn't care about belonging. It only cares that you show up, prepared, focused, steady. And I would. I didn't go straight back to base. I took back roads. No destination, no flight manifest. Just me, the open highway, and a sky I couldn't touch from the ground. The deeper I drove into the countryside, the quieter everything became cornfields folding in on themselves, barns standing like forgotten monuments. Every so often I passed through small towns that looked like copies of my own. The same white steeples, the same diners, the same people pretending the world wasn't bigger than what they could see from their porches. I wondered how many women like me had left towns like these only to return hollowed out, made smaller for the comfort of others. How many had decided it wasn't worth it? How many never made it out at all? I pulled off at a little clearing just before dusk. No signs, just a gravel path and an overlook. Below the trees spread out in waves of dark green. I sat on the hood of my truck, arms crossed, chin tilted to the clouds, and I asked myself the hardest question: who am I when I'm not flying? Not the call sign, not the jacket, not the mission, just me, the woman underneath all of it, the one no one ever bothered to meet. A part of me knew why the silence from my family hurt so much. It wasn't just that they didn't see me, it's that they never tried. It would have taken one honest question. What do you fly, Dana? Where do you go? What does it feel like up there above everything? But they didn't want the answer, because the answer would mean seeing me clearly, and seeing me clearly would mean accepting that I'd chosen a life they didn't approve of and that I was still whole. I remembered a flight years ago, high-altitude recon over the Bering Sea. The equipment had glitched, fuel reserves tighter than they should have been. We were flying low under radar, no room for error, and for a moment I thought, this is it. Not panic, just clarity. A cold, quiet awareness of mortality. But even then, I hadn't felt fear, only purpose. And now, sitting on that truck hood, grounded and gutted, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Loneliness. Not the kind that comes from being single. The kind that comes from never being known. I stayed out there until the stars came. No one texted, no one called. It was almost funny in a bleak way. I'd spent years risking everything to be someone worth remembering, and the people who were supposed to love me couldn't even remember the color of my eyes. They remembered my rank at birth, not the one I earned. They remembered my shoes at Easter, not my medals. They remembered my absence, not my sacrifice. And I let them. That was the worst part. I let them, because a part of me still hoped they'd come around. That hope, quiet, stubborn, was what kept me coming back to birthday parties and engagement dinners and cold, smiling holidays. But out there in the dark, I realized hope is only holy when it's mutual. Otherwise, it's a slow kind of self-harm. I leaned back and closed my eyes, tried to remember the last time I'd felt safe, not physically. I'd been in war zones that felt safer than my own family table. I meant emotionally. When had I last exhaled in a room and known without doubt that I didn't have to prove anything? Not for rank, not for love, not for space. I couldn't remember, not a single moment. That realization didn't break me, but it hollowed something out, something old, something I didn't need to carry anymore. And in that space, something new stirred, not anger, not pride, just resolve. I stood up stretched and looked out over the trees one last time. Somewhere out there, someone still believed in me. I wasn't sure who. Maybe the ops team waiting on that base. Maybe Major L. Maybe the girl at the airfield desk who stood a little straighter when she saw my clearance. But most importantly, me. I still believed. Not because of the uniforms. Not because of the flight hours. Not because of the nods from men in higher places. But because I'd been to the edge of obscurity and I hadn't let go. Because I'd faced my family's disappointment and chose to keep flying. Because I had built something real out of air and silence and strength, and that meant I wasn't lost. Just underestimated. The next morning, I drove to a small cafe on the outskirts of Kalamazoo, ordered black coffee and eggs, sat near the window. I watched families come and go, mothers checking hairlines, kids dragging shoes, couples debating grocery lists. And I realized something I could have had that. Could have faked a life for their approval. Could have dimmed myself down to fit their frame, but I would have lost the one thing that kept me whole. Flight was never the escape. It was the return. To myself. Every single time. By 10 a.m., I was on the road again. Not fast, not frantic, just steady. There was a message waiting for me on the secure line when I reached the regional base. It was short. Briefing pushed. Your primary on call. Instructions to follow. Minister acknowledged your file. No salutation, no explanation. But one word stood out, acknowledged. They saw me, the ones who mattered, the ones who moved pieces on a higher board, the ones who didn't need to understand my family to trust my hands on the controls. They'd called. I was ready. And this time, I wouldn't carry the weight of their ignorance with me. I'd leave it behind, exactly where it belonged. 3 days after the reception, I found myself back in my apartment, the pale light of morning pushing through gauzy curtains. I hadn't unpacked. The dress I wore to the party hung on the back of my chair, faintly wrinkled, still carrying the scent of expensive perfume and my mother's condescension. Her voice still echoed in my head. 6 flight licenses. What for flying pizza deliveries? I ran my fingers along the edge of the countertop, tracing invisible lines like they held answers. They didn't. But I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was remembering. The silence in my living room was thick. I let it stretch. I was done explaining myself to people who had no intention of listening. My family hadn't just mocked me. They'd rewritten me in their minds, shrunk me to the version they needed me to be so they could feel taller, and for years I let them. But I wasn't powerless. I never had been. I pulled open the drawer next to my desk. Inside, a black case. Simple, clean. I flipped it open. 6 laminated cards. FAA Commercial Multi-Engine Seaplane Turbine IFR Drone Grade Instructor Rating. Each one hard-earned. Hours in simulators. Nights reviewing weather charts. Months overseas under special clearance flying government-contracted surveillance routes that never made the news. They weren't the kind of licenses people framed, but they were the kind someone in power always noticed. I slipped them into my jacket pocket, not out of pride, but because I was done hiding. I didn't start flying to impress anyone. I started because I needed to know what freedom felt like. Real freedom. Up there, with nothing but sky and the hum of the engine, the world made sense. On the ground, everything was rules, insults, and invisible chains. Up there, it was just me, time, and control, and maybe that's why it stung so much when my own family mocked it. Like they knew exactly where to strike. They didn't think it was real. They didn't think I was real. I walked into the hangar that afternoon quiet, focused. Jeff was already there, my mentor once. Still a good friend. Back already, he said, sliding a clipboard into place. I nodded. Didn't go as planned. He raised an eyebrow. Family, yeah. He didn't ask for details. Jeff was the kind of man who understood pain without prodding it. He gestured toward the panel. She's fueled and pre-checked. My plane. Not a commercial liner. Not a luxury jet. A Falcon Twin turboprop dark gray light worn on the edges, customized inside for, well, special things. The kind of flights not listed on public manifests. My contract wasn't technically classified, but it wasn't public either. Jeff's voice dropped as he handed me the headset. Minister needs an extraction. You're cleared to land by 1800. That was all he said. That was all I needed. In the sky again, I let the past fade behind me like vapor trails. Clouds broke below me in soft layers. Somewhere, a low sun touched the tips of the peaks like gold dipped in mercy. My hands rested light on the controls. I didn't need to force anything. I knew the air. I knew this space. And more than anything, I knew who I was. They didn't. But that wouldn't matter much longer. The drop point was discreet. An airstrip carved into high-altitude jungle terrain, the kind of place you only reached if you were expected or very lucky. I landed with barely a bump. The minister's security team was waiting. 2 men approached, both in black with subtle lapel pins unmarked. But not unfamiliar. One nodded at me. You're earlier than expected, Ms. Halberg. Winds were in our favor, I replied smoothly. The other opened the rear door of my craft and paused. He said to tell you he appreciated the way you handled Caracas. My mouth didn't move. But inside, that was the moment I realized something important. They remembered. People who mattered remembered. I didn't need applause from my mother or validation from my cousins. The people I flew for, the ones who operated without stage lights or speeches, knew exactly who I was. And more importantly, they trusted me. That night, back at the hangar, Jeff met me with a silent nod. I handed off the clearance report and said nothing else. He did. You know they'll come around. I shook my head. That's not the point. He looked at me for a long moment. Then what as I hesitated? And then I said it not for him, but for me. I'm done trying to be visible in rooms that never wanted to see me. Later, alone, I sat by the edge of my bed jacket, still on boots unlaced. I pulled out my licenses again, turned them over one by one in the moonlight. These weren't just certifications, they were testimonies, not of brilliance, but of persistence, of cold morning takeoffs, of emergency reroutes with lives on board, of nights waiting in foreign airfields with just coordinates, wind shear alerts, and trust. Every time I touched the sky, I had carved space for myself in a world that never invited me. And now it was time for the world to remember, but not because I would shout. I didn't need volume. I had altitude. The next morning, I was wheels up again before sunrise. But this time, it wasn't for an extraction. It was for me. There's a stretch of airspace between D.C. and North Dakota where the sky opens wider than anywhere else in the States. No towers, no chatter, just altitude and clarity. I needed that silence to think. Not about my family, but about what came next. Because something had shifted. Not in them. In me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running from their laughter. I was running towards something they couldn't touch. I banked right sunlight flaring off the cockpit glass and felt the old tension in my shoulders dissolve. Up here, I wasn't the girl with too many licenses or the quiet one who never fit at the dinner table. I was just me, pilot, strategist, operative. Whatever label worked, I'd earned all of them. But there was still something I needed to do. I wasn't flying toward closure. I was flying toward my past. I landed in Sioux Falls 3 hours later, touched down smooth as silk, and taxied to a private hangar I hadn't visited in 5 years. The door was still marked Mason Aerospace. My first job. They had no idea what I'd gone on to do. I'd left quietly, no headlines, no fanfare. But now I wasn't coming back to reminisce. I was coming to borrow a favor. Inside, the air smelled like oil, coffee, and old ambition. Mason himself looked up from the engine block he was leaning over, still tall, still gruff, still wearing the same navy cap he'd worn when I was 22 and trying to prove I was worth the cockpit. "Elena," he said. I smiled. "You always did remember voices faster than faces." He wiped his hands on a rag. "Well, you never did call. I'm calling now." We sat in his office maps sprawled across the table. "What's this?" he asked, tapping a satellite image. "Landing clearance for a restricted NATO airstrip outside Munich," I said, sliding a document toward him. "I'm picking up someone." He frowned. "This isn't a military op, no. It's personal." He looked at me harder. "You planning to do something reckless? I'm planning to do something precise." Mason never did like cryptic answers, but he respected one thing more than details discipline. So he nodded. "You need a plane." I tapped my jacket. "Brought my own." He smirked. "Then why are you here?" I reached into my bag and pulled out a small hard case. Inside, encrypted comm links, spare IDs, and one thing that made him go still. "Is that from Langley?" I said. "Temporary designation override? I can put anyone under my air clearance code for 36 hours. He sat back. "Who the hell are you flying?" I didn't answer. Not because I couldn't, but because it didn't matter. That night, I filed my clearance request under the diplomatic corridor just as I'd done dozens of times before. But this time, my flight manifest had one unmissable name under Secondary Civilian Pickup Minister Helena Voss. German Aerospace Defense Chair, Special Advisor to EU Aviation Alliances. Also my former instructor during a NATO security pilot exchange 6 years ago. She remembered me. She still owed me a favor, and she'd already confirmed pickup. 2 days later, I landed in a private zone at the edge of Stuttgart. A black SUV pulled up silent, polished, unmarked. And then she stepped out, Helena Voss. Hair swept back in a tight gray bun, sunglasses, silk scarf, not a wrinkle on her navy coat, power in every footfall. She didn't smile, but she nodded once. "You came. I said I would." She stepped close, voice low. "They know what you've done for the last 5 years. I've made sure of it." I nodded, and now she adjusted her scarf. "Now you let them see it." The flight back was quiet. She worked from a tablet in the back seat, barely speaking. But just before descent into D.C., she leaned forward. "Elena," she said, "it's not just about proving them wrong." I looked at her through the mirror. "I know," I replied. "It's about reminding myself I was never small." She leaned back again, satisfied. We touched down at a secure landing pad outside the city, technically off limits to civilians. But I wasn't civilian, not that day. Not under the designation she'd issued. As the hangar doors opened, another black SUV rolled up. And this time, I wasn't surprised. Out stepped a federal liaison officer. Tall, badged, holding a folder. "Elena Hallberg, yes. You've been cleared for brief strategic advisory placement for next quarter's Aero Coordination Summit. Direct invitation." From who he handed me the folder, inside a letter. One line stood out. "We recognize capability, not pedigree." Office of the National Aerospace Minister. My hands didn't shake, but my heart did. I drove home that night in silence. Didn't even turn on the radio. My phone buzzed once. A group message, the family chat. My mother had posted a photo of me taken from a distance, zoomed in walking beside Voss as we exited the aircraft. Her caption, "Who knew our little flyer had connections?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That weekend I showed up to brunch. Not for them, for me. They stared when I walked in heels, clicking Blazer crisp folder in hand. I didn't announce anything. I just took my seat. Someone my aunt maybe cleared her throat. "You, really flew her in?" I just tilted my head. "She requested me." Mom sipped her mimosa, hands stiff. No one laughed. No one mocked. And for the first time, I wasn't waiting for their reaction. I was simply watching. They'd always tried to make me smaller, but I was never powerless. I had been flying above their gaze for years, and now they were finally looking up. The invitation looked ordinary, just thick cream cardstock heavy enough to signal weight with my name embossed in simple serif. Elena Hallberg, Private Advisory Session. Restricted Briefing Location, U.S. Aviation Defense Council. Subcommittee. 4 Joint Command Conference date. Saturday, 0900 hours. I ran my fingers over the raised lettering. The real weight wasn't in the paper. It was in what it meant. For years, my achievements lived in shadows, quiet halls, encrypted airstrips, foreign deployments no one would ever read about. Now they wanted me seen. And the date. It fell on the morning of Mom's annual family showcase brunch, a gathering she hosted every year to highlight her children's successes. Aunts, uncles, church friends, slideshows, clapping, forced applause. I hadn't been invited in 4 years, but this year, oh, I'd be there. That morning, I didn't wear the leather jacket or boots I normally flew in. I wore a black suit. No name tag. Just a small lapel pin in the shape of a falcon. I packed light briefing folder clearance pass and an old coin Voss had handed me the night she arrived. For when they try to shrink you again, she'd said, let this remind you you earned every sky you crossed. The coin stayed in my palm the whole way there. The Defense Council building was quiet on weekends. No protesters, no journalists, just rows of tinted windows and the low hum of protected air. Inside, I passed through 5 layers of security, each one smoother than the last. The final checkpoint, a retinal scan. When the officer cleared me, he didn't even make eye contact. Just handed me a badge and said, they're expecting you, ma'am. Ma'am, not Ms. Hallberg, not Miss. Ma'am, not because I was older, because I held weight. Inside the chamber, the room was smaller than I imagined. Not a huge conference hall. Just 12 chairs, a round table, and a central monitor. Waiting in the room were 3 people I'd only seen in security briefings: Admiral Roy Hatcher, Navy Airspace Oversight, Dr. Carla Min, Quantum Flight Systems Advisor. And seated at the head Undersecretary Layton, the quiet brain behind cross-continental military air alliances. Each of them nodded. Each of them already knew who I was. They didn't ask for introductions. Layton simply opened a folder and said, Elena, we've been reviewing your Asia-Pacific assignments. Then he added, we think you can see patterns the rest of us overlook. We didn't talk about medals, or family, or who doubted who. We talked airspace intercept patterns over Kalimantan, emergency landing corridors over unstable zones, encrypted signal variances from European satellite relays. I spoke, they listened. They asked, I answered. There was no applause, only stillness. And I realized something: I was not there to impress them. I was there to inform them. After the session, Layton handed me a sealed envelope. You'll receive official notification next week, he said, but we wanted to deliver this in person. I nodded, didn't open it, didn't need to. I already knew what was inside. I left the council building just before 11:00 a.m. The Hallberg Showcase brunch started at noon. The drive across town took 30 minutes. Just enough time to breathe. Just enough time to decide I wasn't going to hide anymore. I wasn't going to shrink just to fit inside their expectations. And I wasn't going to argue. I was simply going to walk in. The brunch was held in a rented hall this year. Big ceilings, white linen, name tags at every place setting. They hadn't printed one for me, but I brought my own. I stepped inside just as my cousin Owen was finishing his presentation on his startup's second funding round. Applause. Laughter. A family friend raised a mimosa and said, the Hallbergs keep winning, huh? I waited until the clapping settled. Then I walked forward, heels echoing on the marble floor. All heads turned. Even the kids stopped talking. My mother stood, eyes narrowing like she wasn't sure if I was real. Elena, she said, voice light but tight. You made it. I nodded once. I did. Someone cleared their throat. Oh, did you want to say something? I held up the envelope. I was at a closed-door Defense Council session this morning. A pause. I continued. They asked me to advise on cross-border aerospace strategy for next quarter. Undersecretary Layton delivered this himself. Gasps rippled through the room like wind across still water. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply opened the envelope, placed it on the table, and took my seat right across from my mother. She didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at the letter, at the name Elena Hallberg, Strategic Advisor Provisional. Then she reached for her mimosa and missed. Glass clinked against the plate, hands trembling. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. You really were flying her in. I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I felt no need to prove anything. I've been flying missions you wouldn't believe. Aunt Laura blinked. Wait, this wasn't a job. This was government. I nodded, most of it classified. Uncle Tom leaned forward. And the woman in that photo was she really? I cut in gently. Minister Voss doesn't do photo ops. She does strategy. And she requested me. No one laughed. No one asked if I was joking. They simply sat there processing the version of me they never took time to see. Not a dreamer. Not a disappointment. A force they'd missed because they never bothered to look past the surface. Power didn't crash in that day. It didn't shout. It didn't punish. It just walked quietly into the room and took its seat. And when it did, they finally realized I was never the one who had to earn their respect. They were the ones who'd failed to see what was already in front of them. After I sat down, the room didn't recover right away. No one reached for the pastries. No one returned to their polite small talk, because my envelope still open, still sitting in the center of the table, had rearranged the atmosphere. Even the air felt heavier, and it wasn't because of the seal from the U.S. Aviation Defense Council or the Provisional Advisor title. It was because it didn't come with fanfare. It came with silence. Silence was harder to explain away. Mom finally found her voice. Elena, why didn't you ever tell us you were involved in something like this? She said it like I'd been sneaking out to play superhero in the dark. I looked at her, really looked, and all I saw was someone so in love with Image she never once asked if there was a deeper story behind the uniform she used to mock. I did, I said quietly. You just didn't listen. Someone cleared their throat behind me. Slow, intentional. Every head turned. He stood near the entrance, tall, wearing a charcoal jacket and tan boots still dusty from tarmac. I knew who it was before I looked. Commander Ash Bennett, U.S. Air Recon, last stationed at Nellis before Voss reassigned him as liaison for sensitive diplomatic escorts. Also the man who personally handled half the extractions I coordinated under blackout flights. Ash didn't speak. He didn't wave. He just looked at me, nodded once, then turned to the room, and saluted, not casually, formally. Hand lifted to brow back, straight eyes steady, directed at me. Gasps. Aunt Marianne dropped her fork. My cousin Devin whispered, What just happened? And still, Ash said nothing. He lowered his hand, crossed the floor, and without asking, set a small flash drive next to the envelope, then addressed the entire table. You'll be briefed on her clearance tier next week. For now, just know Minister Voss doesn't assign passengers. She assigns assets. And Elena Hallberg's logged more silent sorties than most of you have seen weather reports. He nodded once, then added more gently, Try not to miss it next time. And he left. It hit them differently, that someone outside the family could speak with such weight about me. No defense, no exaggeration, just fact. Undeniable, undeniably quiet. Uncle Tom stood awkward. I had no idea. I tilted my head. You were never supposed to. But that was a military officer, a commander. Correct. Mom's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. You mean this whole time, while I thought you were just flying the occasional rescue, I was coordinating encrypted logistics and landing under foreign blackout. I let that sit, let them process, and then I stood too. Because I hadn't come to gloat. I'd come to mark the line between the version of me they had created and the version they never bothered to know. I stepped up to the center of the room, took the coin from my pocket, and placed it gently on the table beside the letter and flash drive. This, I said softly, is the only proof I'll leave. No explanation of what the coin meant, no bragging, no defense, just a line. Between then and now. People talk about climax like it's loud, but real power stands still. It doesn't raise its voice. It raises presence. And suddenly, just like that, I was no longer the forgotten one at the table. I was the one they were afraid to misunderstand again. After I left, I didn't look back. Not once. I didn't need to. Because as I walked out of that building, I knew something had shifted forever, and when Ash joined me near the curb and held out the keys to the SUV, he didn't smile or say, "Told you so." He just opened the passenger door and said briefings moved to Monday. Voss added a second tier. "She wants your voice on it." I slipped in. "Copy that." Then paused, turned toward him, and said the only thing that really mattered now. "Thanks for standing when no one else did." He glanced sideways. I didn't stand for them. He met my eyes. "I stood because I've seen you fly." That's the thing. They mocked my licenses, dismissed the training, laughed at the test hours, and called my flight paths a hobby. But now, they couldn't unsee the salutes. They couldn't unhear the silence. And they definitely couldn't erase what happened when a decorated commander walked into their neat little brunch and made the entire room freeze with a single gesture. Not a medal, not a speech. A salute. They say the loudest revenge is silence, but I disagree. The loudest revenge is being saluted without asking for it, because that silence, that stillness, it speaks volumes, and the echo lasts forever. I didn't return home that week, or the week after. The SUV dropped me at base. Voss's team met me inside a debriefing room with no windows and too many layers of clearance. They handed me a packet labeled Tier 2, Coastal Air Assets Classified Embedded Civilian. Inside was a mission schematic I couldn't speak of even now. But more than that, there was a shift in the way people looked at me, walked beside me, stood when I entered briefing rooms. I wasn't the shadow anymore. I was the center, not because I demanded it, because I'd earned it. 3 weeks later, I found a letter in my apartment mailbox. No stamp. Just a note written on heavy paper in my mother's handwriting. "Elena, I don't know what you've become, but I realize now I never knew what you were building. I thought success meant polish applause spotlight. You showed me it can mean something else. Quiet strength, still presence. Forgive me if you ever can. Mom." I sat on the couch for a long time after reading it, not crying, not angry, just still. Because forgiveness isn't an apology, it's a decision. I didn't call her back, not right away. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I needed her to sit in that silence. The silence she had created, and the one she now had to learn from. 6 months passed. The operations I ran didn't make the news, but their results echoed in the corridors of embassies and back channels. I was never introduced as the pilot with 6 licenses anymore. I was introduced as her. Sometimes that's all they'd say. "She'll lead this phase," or "She's here. We can proceed." No one questioned the silence, because people who mattered already knew the weight behind it. Then, one afternoon, as I was reviewing a comms brief inside a control tower in New Mexico, the receptionist called me to the front desk. "There's a visitor," she said. I raised an eyebrow. Clearance made visits rare. She handed me a name card. It read, "Lieutenant Devin McKay, Civil Aviation Cadet Instructor, my cousin. The one who laughed when I first applied for my 3rd certification." I stepped outside. He was standing near the fence line, hands tucked behind his back like a student waiting for inspection. When he saw me, he smiled, but not the cocky grin he used to flash across Thanksgiving tables. This one was tight, respectful, real. I came to ask something, he said. I waited. He nodded toward the hangar behind me. "There's a cadet in my program, top of her class, quiet, insanely focused. Reminds me of you." He hesitated. "I think she'd fly better if she knew someone like you existed." I folded my arms. "And what does that mean?" He cleared his throat. "I'd like to bring her here, let her meet you, hear your story, not the one the family used to tell. The real one." I looked at him long and hard, and saw something I hadn't seen in my family in years. Humility. "Fine," I said. "One condition." He waited. She doesn't meet me. She meets her own future. He frowned. I pointed to the empty runway behind me. Get her on a headset. Show her what happens when you trust your gut and fly into something no one else understands yet. He smiled slowly. That sounds like you. I shrugged. It is. I never needed them to apologize. Not really. What I needed was for them to understand. And eventually, they did. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece. Like when Aunt Marianne sent me a text with a photo of her daughter holding a model aircraft captioned, "She wants to be like you." Or when Uncle Tom changed his bio to include proud uncle of a U.S. aviation advisor. Or the day I opened my inbox and saw an RSVP marked "Yes" from Mom for the Quiet Valor Awards ceremony, even though I'd never told her I was attending. They learned in silence, like I did. At that ceremony, I didn't win the headliner award, didn't make the podium, didn't even get called out by name. But just before the final remarks as we stood during the flag retreat, the Secretary of Defense turned toward the second row, met my eyes, and nodded. No words, just acknowledgement. Quiet, precise, complete. Afterward, my mother approached me. She didn't look the same. Her makeup was lighter, her posture less sharp, more real. She opened her mouth, closed it, then simply said, "You don't need to say anything." I didn't, but I held her hand for a moment. That was enough. They used to mock my licenses. They don't anymore. Now they say my name with a pause. That little beat of respect you can't fake. The kind you only earn when you stand still while others run their mouths and let your flight path speak for itself.